So we are now in the midpoint of a sermon series called Unbound, where throughout Lent we are trying to find out ways that we can unbind ourselves from the ways of the world to allow ourselves to see the world differently, to be able to experience life differently, to be able to impact the world differently. And we talked early on about the blindness that can come, the binding that can come, just as real as chains and ropes and barbed wire from the illusions that the world tries to hide our eyes to be able to see the reality of what Jesus tries to teach us. And one of the worst illusions that the world tries to tell us is that you are not powerful, is that you are unworthy and you are not able to affect what happens in this world. When Jesus says, and Isaiah says, no, you are more powerful than you can possibly imagine. It is just a matter of choice of which path you choose to take. And because you are that powerful, your choices matter. And we talked in the second week about becoming unbound from fear, because our fear is what holds us back from changing, holds us back from letting go of those illusions so that we can see the world clearly, which can sometimes be painful. So we look at ourselves in the mirror and see some things that we might not like, that we say we know we need to change. That can be hard, but that fear can keep us from doing it, and so we end up frozen where we are. And then last week, we talked about how it gets even more insidious when illusions about who we are and fear mix. And what happens when those mix is shame is created. We believe the illusions of who people tell us we are the worst actions that we've ever taken in our lives, and we fear that that can never change, and so therefore we are trapped in this degree of shame, but Jesus releases us from all of that, or offers to do that if we but accept that offer to follow the light that Jesus gives us, follow the way and the example that he provides. What we find in this today is that this passage is often summarized as, wow, Jesus is awesome. He can cure blind people. And boo, Pharisees, right? It's like anybody play yay, boo? Like when you're kids or anything? It's like someone says something, say, Jesus is great. Yay, the Pharisees. Boo, right? But this is not what this is about. What this passage is very much about, but is almost always lost, is there are three distinct examples of how blind spots have been embedded in different people. From the disciples, to the neighbors who the blind person knew, to the Pharisees themselves. So let's dig a little bit into these ideas as we get into this message called Unbound from Blindness. And we're in the Gospel according to John chapter 9, and it opens with, as Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind. This is important. Blind from birth, right? This is very important to remember. From birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Let's stop right there for a second. All right. What in the world did this baby do in his mother's womb to deserve to be born blind? Nothing. Right? Absolutely nothing. But the question from the disciples wasn't, did somebody do something to make him born blind? It wasn't a question of whether or not someone sinned. They asked the question, who was the one who sinned? So it started from a framework that already assumed that someone sinned in order for this child, kind of adult now, so probably like somewhere between 16 and 20, right? Somewhere between 16 and 20 in the story. We don't know exactly, but we know it's kind of in that range somewhere. All right, it's like, who sinned? Because the operating assumption was that if something bad happened to somebody, they must have done something wrong. And God was displeased, and so God punished them, which sadly is still a framework from which a lot of people view God. And assume, what did I do to deserve this? What did I do to deserve this horrible thing that happened to me? And it's such a destructive view of a punishing God when what that is an attempt to protect from the idea that, you know what? Sometimes life happens. Sometimes life happens. And we don't know where it's going to come from, and that's scary. So we want to create this other thing, that there must be a deeper reason for why this horrible thing happened to me. And sometimes it's our own decisions, but sometimes somebody just did something and it happened randomly, and the lightning struck and it had nothing to do with that person at all. But their mindset is, who sinned? And so they have no ability. They're locked into this and have a blind spot from being able to even ask the question, did anybody sin in the first place? So like, who sinned? And Jesus is like, nobody sinned. Life just happens. And there's this curious phrase in there. It's like, well, he was born blind to give glory to God. That doesn't mean that God made him blind and made him wait for 16 to 20 years for Jesus to show up. It's a turn of phrase that just means the person was blind at this moment, and Jesus is here to bring glory to God and to be able to show God's glory through something bad that happened. Because God always promises. God doesn't promise to keep bad things from happening. God promises to always be with us if something bad happens. And to try to do something that we can learn, or something to redeem that when it happens. Then the story turns after his sight is restored, and he is there with the neighbors and the people who go by. And it says, the neighbors and the people who knew him as a beggar and knew him as a blind person. This isn't someone who you just saw on the street once in the Bronx when you were walking in New York. This is somebody that all of the people who we're talking about right now knew. Seen over and over and over again. It was a relatively small town in a small area, and all the people we're about to talk about now, all of them would have known him. And they're like, is it him? Like, they all knew him. They knew what he looked like. The only difference was he could see now. Right? He hadn't cut his hair. He hadn't changed his clothes. It's the exact same person. But they're asking, is it him? And some people say, yep, it's him. But other people say, no. And he's like, it's me. And they're like, nope. Because they have a blind spot. That they are unwilling to look at the person they've always seen one way and allow themselves to see him differently. How often have people been trapped in stories in the Bible or in the world where someone is trying to change, doing their best to change, but all the people who know them refuse to let them change because that makes them uncomfortable that they're willing to change. I know people who have had difficult circumstances that have changed their lives, accepted Jesus into their hearts, followed that light, followed that example, completely changed, and now people go up to them and say, I don't know you anymore. Try to drag them back into that life that was so destructive before. The blind spot of not being willing to let someone change. Then we get to part 3. Part 3 with the Pharisees, and it's really important to remember. The Pharisees aren't bad people. The Pharisees were good, well-intended, faithful leaders of the people, trying to do the right things for the right reasons. And yes, most of them were against Jesus, and they weren't ready for Jesus. And yes, a lot of the Pharisees and a lot of the Sadducees led to Jesus' death. That is absolutely true. Even though the Romans did it, that's absolutely true. But a lot of the Pharisees did listen, and a lot of the Pharisees did try to change and listen to what Jesus had to say. But we have this. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. And they're like, oh, okay, who did this? Jesus. And the Pharisees say, the man is not from God because he does not observe the Sabbath. Now, when the Sabbath happened, you weren't required to just stay in your home. Right? There were certain things you were allowed to do, certain things you were not allowed to do. And most of things were determined by the Pharisees. What was allowed, what was not allowed, was not just rules from God, from the Torah. It was additional rules that they had to make up as society changed. So these were the Pharisees' rules that they perceived as being broken, because you were allowed to save somebody's life on the Sabbath. You were allowed to save the life of an animal on the Sabbath, but you couldn't heal. But that is something that their rules were creating. Their rules were creating. So here we have a situation where we have some of the Pharisees saying Jesus is bad. Jesus is bad. And so they have that lens on. They have that lens on that because he violated this one rule of theirs, that he is bad, and so whatever he did, even if it was good, they were going to see it through the lens of him being bad. And so their blind spot was their own rules, their own religious framework that they had created that set a perspective that only gave them a particular way of thinking that automatically determined how they were going to view Jesus in this circumstance. Some other ones were like, some of the other Pharisees were like, but if we don't do that, if we look at it differently, if we look at what he did, and they started to look at Jesus very differently because they didn't start with the filter of their own religious rules. They just took it at face value. And they're like, no, and Jesus is bad, and the guy who is no longer blind is like, are you sure he's bad? Right, and we have all these different stories about them calling him and asking him and then sending him away and calling and asking him again and bringing in the parents and all this kind of stuff. And that's just like for fun storytelling and all that kind of stuff. But basically, the guy's like, are you sure he's bad? And he doesn't get into all kinds of complex theology. He's like, look, I don't know. I don't know about all this sinner stuff. I don't know about all this, like, breaking your rule kind of thing. This is all I know. I'm going to get rid of all my filters, anything that I thought of before. Because he had his own ways of thinking before. He's like, all I know about this circumstance and this Jesus guy is this. Once I was blind, and now I see. I once was blind, and now I see. And the response to that, after he kind of points out the hypocrisy of some of the things, then the Pharisees are like, look, both of you are sinners. Not only is Jesus a sinner, but now that you're defending Jesus and you're showing us the inconsistencies in our argument and you're taking away our blind spots, the only conclusion we can have is Jesus is a sinner and you're a sinner. And at the end of this, they go right back to where the disciples started. Who sinned? And he said, you. And the Pharisees say, you have been a sinner from birth. And try to return him to this teeny, unworthy spot where they'd like to keep him. I know you can't see it. That's how small they tried to make him. That's what shame in religious institutions can make people feel like. And he said, get out. Get out. Now, I'd like a little flexibility here because we're going to go through an exercise, a congregational exercise here. Del, will you throw up the slide, please? All right. Please read the statement up on the wall. I'll read it. The most effective of all human fears, which prevents the development of full potential, is the fear of failure and the fear of success. Show of hands, there's no right or wrong answer. How many people would agree with that statement? All right. How many people disagree with that statement? All right. So now I want you to do something a little different. Now I would like you to count the number. I'm going to give you about 20, 30 seconds to do this. Count the number of F's, the letter F's, that there are on that page. Do not shout the number out. Just keep it to yourself. But when you think you know the answer, just put your hand up so I can get a sense of how far along we are with how many people know the number of F's that are in here. And I'll wait for us to get to about half for people who have gone through this and see how far we get with this. Love the color on the hair today, Mariah. It's outstanding. That's all right. It's fine if it changes every time you can. All right, so you can keep looking at it. You can keep counting. You don't have to stop looking. You can keep editing if you want. How many people got 5, 6, or 7? All right, for the people who got 7, anybody who got 7, keep your hand up. All right, is anybody here who got 7 willing to bet me $5, a real $5, I'm not going to give it back to you, and it's not for me, but to donate to the community kitchen, that you're right that it's 7 Fs. Anybody who's willing to bet me $5 on that? Okay. Excellent. All right, I got you. I'm keeping you on the honor system here. All right, because right now I'm about to collect $40 for the community kitchen. All right, who got 8? All right, we got a number of people of 8. How many of you who have 8 are willing to put $5 on the line for the community kitchen to say that 8 is the right number? Oh, I'm going to pay for this. My wife has her hand up. All right. So honor system, same thing. All right, you owe me that $5. Who got 9? All right. How many people here are willing to bet $5 for the community kitchen that it's actually 9? All right. Honor system for the people who keep your hands up. If you don't want to, that's totally fine. All right. Thank you for your donation. How many people got 10? All right. Is there anybody here who's willing to make a bet for $5 to the community kitchen that 10 is the right number? All right, thank you for your donation. Did anybody get 11? All right, anybody get 11? Go ahead, Del, throw up the next slide. Go ahead, there are the Fs. What most of you experienced, any of you missed the ofs? Right. Every time I have done this, it's the same result. I did this in my corporate training career. So you don't have to give them to me right now. You can give them to me later. I don't need video of everybody throwing singles at me, right? It's just going to be a bad, right? But this is an example of a concept called lock-in, lock-out. That would not have happened if I had not had you read it the first time. If you just focus on the Fs. Because you read it through one time, your brain locked out certain of the words and certain of the letters for many of you just because I had you read it one time before. And your brain determined that some of that information was not necessary. And so when it was necessary, the second time you saw the same thing, you had blind spots and most of you were unable to actually get the number that were on there. And here's why this is important. Because our thinking is made up by the information that we allow ourselves to have. And when we have blind spots, our thinking is affected. And thinking is what leads to our actions. Right? And the actions is what leads to our results. So if we have good thinking, what do we tend to get? Survey says, there we go. How about that? Excellent. All right. So when we have blind spot thinking, where there are blind spots all over the place, what kind of results are we going to get if our thinking is relying on blind spots and our thinking has changed and our actions have changed? What kind of results are we going to get? Not as good results, right? Bad results. Thank you, Del. I appreciate that. All right. So the question that I have for you all today is this. Where are your blind spots? Where are your blind spots? Are they in assumptions that you have already made about life that will cause you to look at someone, just because of what you have already decided, look at someone with filters already on, already determining where they're going to be or who they are or how that is? Do you have frameworks, religious or otherwise, that already have you deciding who someone is? Do you have filters on that say this person is like this and they're never going to be able to change? Do you have blind spots that say you're never going to be able to change? Because this matters. It matters for your life and it matters for this world. Particularly in this moment for this reason, because a lot of people are motivated to be doing actions and visibility and actions towards social justice facing the crisis that we have in our country in this moment. But we have our blind spots too, and it is easy to assume that people who we disagree with are all the ones with the blind spots and we are not. Do you have a blind spot from only going to one type of information where you get what's going on in the world? Do you have a blind spot from making an assumption that someone who disagrees with you is therefore unable to change or uncaring about the country? Do you have a blind spot that everybody who is doing things that you're scared about is actually not a good person versus just disagrees with you? There is a lot to not like about what is going on in the world, and I know that is weighing on a lot of your hearts. Not all of you, but I know it is the vast majority of you, based on the conversations that I am having with all of you in the community here, the community of faith, and the wider community. But it is important when we decide to get together and do, whether it is a protest or a social justice action, for us to not pretend to be self-righteous, that we have all the answers and we have all the information and that we do not have our own blind spots. If we are going to go out and represent positions and try to do the right thing, if we don't look at ourselves in the mirror, both as individuals and a church, and we go out with blind spots, we're going to have blind spot thinking, which is create blind spot actions, which is going to create bad results. We need to look. Doesn't mean we freeze, no analysis paralysis. We can get out there and go do what we are going to do to make this community a better place. But I beg you, for your benefit and for the world's benefit, to take the time and look where your blind spots, your assumptions, your filters are that can cause us to go out in a way that could potentially do harm. And guess who can help with that? It's right here. Jesus is like, I can help with that. I can help with that. Because there is a way that provides light in the midst of uncertainty, that provides an example for what to do, and it leads with loving your enemy. And it leads with doing things that are unexpected and challenging, and not all the things that we love to be able to say. Jesus loved to take care of the poor and the hurting and battling justice, sure, but he also calls us to not condemn the people who we disagree with. And I am as guilty of that as anybody in this room and anybody online. Jesus shows us a way that can change the world and did change the world without condemning the people around. It doesn't mean that he didn't tell them he disagreed with them. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have this example of him going in to cleanse the temple with whips and turning tables, like so it's okay to go out there and do the civil disobedience and be vocal and go out there and go crazy. But don't assume you know it all. And when you do it, use this as your guide. Use Jesus and the light and the example and the challenging example that he gives as the guide for what we do. And then we have a better chance of being unbound from blindness and being able to do something that will really, really matter in this time of tremendous need. Amen.